Dr. Paul Offit is the director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, as well as the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and a professor of pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a recipient of many awards and the author of more than 160 papers in medical and scientific journals and 6 books. Dr. Offit is also the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine, RotaTeq. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. So what I thought we could talk about today are the kinds of questions that we get asked in our clinic from parents who are concerned about vaccines, and we'll just go through them one at a time. So we'll start with sort of the obvious big question is, are vaccines safe? The short answer to that question is yes, but it depends on how you define safe. Well, the definition that we use is the medical definition, which is to say that the benefits of a vaccine have to clearly and definitively outweigh its risks. It's not a legal definition, which is more of absolute safety. I mean, nothing's absolutely safe, and vaccines, like any medical product, anything that has a positive effect will have a negative effect. So the issue is whether or not the benefits outweigh the risks, and the answer is that assuming there's not a medical contraindication for a specific vaccine, the benefits outweigh the risks for every vaccine, for every individual. Now, this isn't to say that vaccines don't have severe adverse effects, because they do. The most common severe adverse event that happens is an allergic reaction, a so-called type 1 hypersensitivity or immediate type allergic reaction to a vaccine component. The most common vaccine component that this is associated with is gelatin. It used to be true that also egg proteins in children who were severely egg allergic also could cause a severe allergic reaction, but that's really not true anymore. And as you'll see over the next year or so, we are going to evolve to really removing egg allergy, even severe egg allergy, from receipt of the influenza vaccine. There is a contraindication to receiving influenza vaccine. Other severe reactions are when we used to use the oral polio vaccine in this country, which we did up until the year 2000. Every year, 1 per 2.4 million doses of the oral polio vaccine was complicated by having polio. I mean, the oral polio vaccine could cause polio. It was a rare reaction, but it was real and it was permanent, and that's why we moved away from the oral polio vaccine to the inactivated vaccine in the year 2000. The yellow fever vaccine, which came to be really in the late 1930s, has probably accounted for about 50 deaths caused from systemic, essentially yellow fever infection in the elderly, meaning those over 65 years of age, where it's been found to infect the liver, infect the spleen. So that too can have severe side effects. It's very rare, but certainly was real. The other problems are in 1976 we used a swine flu vaccine. It was given to about 40 million Americans. It was found to be a rare cause of something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is an ascending paralysis that occurred in roughly 1 per 100,000 recipients. Another rare reaction was Pandemrix, was a squalene adjuvanted influenza vaccine that was used in Europe, and it was used in Scandinavian countries. Was found to be a rare cause of something called narcolepsy, which is a disorder of wakefulness. Again, that was a real and permanent side effect occurring between 1 in 15,000 and 1 in 50,000 people. We never use Pandemrix, that squalene adjuvanted flu vaccine in this country, and we now know the problem that will never be a problem again, because it happened to have some contaminating influenza nuclear protein that was in that vaccine that will not be true going forward. And so probably the last one is that measles-containing vaccine can cause a lowering of the platelet count. It happens in about 1 in 30,000 people who receive it. It's temporary. We occasionally see this in our hospital, but that's not permanent. So vaccines do have side effects. This is true of anything, but I would say that probably the most dangerous aspect of getting vaccines, just statistically, is driving to the office to get them. That puts you at greatest risk. Okay, so the next question is, if you look in the package insert, for example, for DTaP, it says that specifically autism has been reported following receipt of this vaccine. Now, this occasionally comes up in people that call me, and here's why that happens. I guess if you learn nothing else from this particular webinar, learn this. Package inserts are not a medical communication document. They're a legal communication document. So those package inserts are written by company lawyers, pharmaceutical company lawyers, in concert with the FDA lawyers. And basically, if any reaction has occurred within 42 days of any dose, it will be in the package insert. every time. So if you look at actually the early package inserts for chickenpox vaccine, it lists broken leg as having been reported within 42 days of receiving a vaccine. Now, do I think that the chickenpox vaccine causes broken legs? No, but that's why it's in there. So I think when people call me and say, you know, I've just read the package insert, and then they're about to ask their question, I cringe because, you know, what's in the package insert is not very helpful if you're trying to understand vaccines. So all this means on this slide when it says DTaP is associated with autism is that autism was reported by either a parent or a physician within 42 days of receiving a dose. All that tells you is that the DTaP vaccine doesn't prevent autism. What it does is it prevents diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis infection. So I think that's what you deal with when you're trying to deal with package inserts. I'll give you another example. I mean, when the rotavirus vaccine, Rototec, was tested in roughly 70,000 people in a prospective placebo-controlled trial, there were 5 cases of Kawasaki's disease in the vaccine group, but none in the placebo group. That was statistically significantly associated, and so that's in the package insert, even though once that vaccine was given to millions of children, that side effect disappeared. Similarly, there were 5 cases of arm and leg fractures in the placebo group and none in the vaccine group. That, too, was statistically significant. That means that we had just proven that the rotavirus vaccine prevents arm and leg fractures, which is not in the package insert, nor should it be, because our vaccine doesn't prevent, or that vaccine, the rotavirus vaccine, doesn't prevent arm and leg fractures. So you just have to be aware of this. I mean, if you flip a coin 5 times, the chance that it comes up heads 5 times in a row is 32 to 1. That's statistically significant. You have just proven that's a 2-headed coin. If you flip it 10,000 times, the chance that it comes up 5 heads in a row is actually pretty high. So when you look at these studies, these pre-licensure studies of tens of thousands of children, sometimes you see statistical associations that aren't meaningful. And here, this is even less than that, whether DTaP is associated with autism, because it just means it's been reported. So ignore it. Okay, so the next question, this is sort of more of an inside baseball-ish kind of question, but we certainly get this question. If vaccines are safe, why does the federal vaccine program compensate people for vaccine injuries? This is more of an anti-vaccine person's stance. I'm talking about more the professional anti-vaccine types. But just so in case you don't know this, there was in the early 1980s associated with sort of a flood of litigation directed against pharmaceutical companies, specifically vaccine makers that made the whooping cough vaccine. There was a concern that the vaccine caused permanent brain damage, which is to say epilepsy or developmental delay, which it didn't. And so as a consequence, there was a program put in place called the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. It was passed and it included, it was passed by actually the Reagan administration, I think, but it included the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. So if there is a side effect, for example, which causes harm following a vaccine, then you can receive compensation through this federal program, and it's supported by a 75-cent federal excise tax on every dose of vaccine. So there's actually more than $3 billion in that program right now. So, for example, if the RotaShield vaccine, which was on the market from 1998 to 1999, was found to be a rare cause of intussusception, which is intestinal blockage, if your child suffered that, then you could be compensated through this program. The program bar is very low. They tend to overcompensate, thinking that if you're going to mandate a vaccine for the United States population, then you really should have a pop-off valve, and this is really what that pop-off valve is. So for example, this program has compensated people who have claimed that they've developed multiple sclerosis following a hepatitis B vaccine. Now, that compensation was awarded even though there are 2 studies, both published in the New England Journal of Medicine, both that have shown that hepatitis B vaccine isn't causally associated with multiple sclerosis. So it's a pop-off valve. It's certainly no way to determine a scientific truth. I mean, scientific truths aren't determined in a courtroom. They're determined in a scientific venue. The courts are not a place to determine scientific truths. If that were true, we'd certainly have to reinvent the way we think about science, given some of the jury verdicts that are out there. Okay, so next. This is, I would say, of all the questions we get, this is probably the most common. Can too many vaccines overwhelm the immune system? I think people, as we've added more and more vaccines to the schedule, you now have in the first 2 years of life vaccines to prevent 14 different diseases. That can mean as many as 26 inoculations during that time. It can mean as many as 5 shots at one time to prevent diseases that most people don't see using biological fluids that most people don't understand. It's not at all surprising that there's pushback. So the question is it too many? I mean, can you really handle all of this? So let me put this in perspective. There's a couple ways to look at this. If you look, say, 100 years ago in 1900, we gave one vaccine, the smallpox vaccine. And certainly one can reasonably argue that 14 vaccines is greater than 1, that the number 14 is greater than 1. But it's really not the number of vaccines that you get that matters. It's the number of immunological components that are in the vaccines that matter. That's what counts. So by immunological component, I mean bacterial protein, bacterial polysaccharide, which is just the complex sugar that coats the bacteria, or viral protein, either structural or non-structural viral proteins. That's what I mean by an immunological component. If you count up all the immunological components that were in the smallpox vaccine, it totaled about 200. Excuse me. Because smallpox is an orthopox virus. It's the largest of the mammalian viruses. It's the only virus you can actually see by light microscopy. It's a big virus. So it has about 200 immunological components. To put this in some perspective, most viruses are much smaller than that. The measles vaccine doesn't contain 200 proteins. It contains 10. The mumps vaccine, 9. The rubella vaccine, 5. So these are much smaller viruses. If you add up all the immunological components that are in the 14 vaccines today, it adds up to about 156. So you actually receive fewer immunological components in vaccines today than you did 100 years ago. Secondly, the notion that vaccines can overwhelm the immune system is, at least from an immunologist standpoint, fanciful. When you're in the womb, you're in a sterile environment. When you enter the world and travel through the birth canal and then enter the world, you're not. And very quickly you have living on the surface of your body trillions of bacteria, literally trillions. You have roughly 10 to the 14th or 100 trillion bacteria on the surface of your body. As distinct from cells, you have about 10 trillion cells in your body. You actually have 10 times more bacteria on the surface of your body than you have cells in your body. I think that if a spaceman came and landed on this planet, they would see humans as just a vehicle for carrying bacteria from one place to the next. And each bacterium has between 2,000 and 6,000 immunological components, and you have trillions of them. So when you give essentially 156 or so immunological components in vaccines, it is not just figuratively, but literally a drop in the ocean of what people encounter and manage every day. And you make an immune response to those commensal bacteria that are on your mucosal surface. You do. You would have to. Otherwise, they will invade and cause harm. So I would argue that a single common cold is actually a much greater challenge to the immune system than is a vaccine. Because when you're presented with these natural, or as an immunologist would say, or virologist would say, wild-type virus, those viruses reproduce themselves very well. They'll reproduce themselves thousands of times in your body, whereas these attenuated strains of vaccine virus will invariably reproduce themselves fewer than 20 times. So it's a much greater chance for your immune system, frankly, just to get a single common cold. So if vaccines overwhelmed our immune system, we wouldn't survive as a species, given what we were forced to encounter and manage every day. Okay, so another question, this is a very common question, is why not use an alternative vaccine schedule? First of all, just to make sure we're clear on terms, there's no such thing as an alternative vaccine schedule. An alternative vaccine schedule does not exist. The only vaccine schedule that is out there is one that is recommended by the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices to the CDC, as well as the Committee of Infectious Diseases of the American Academy of Pediatrics. There is, however, a very popular book. It's written by a guy named Robert Sears from the Sears parenting family. It's called The Vaccine Book, Making the Right Decision for Your Child. That book has at the back of it 2 pages that are called Dr. Bob's Alternative Vaccine Schedule. So this is a guy who basically just sat in his office and made up a schedule. I mean, it's a little tougher than that. And when we're trying to make vaccines, the way it typically works is when you make a vaccine, you cannot get the vaccine onto the schedule until you prove that your vaccine doesn't interfere with the safety profile and doesn't interfere with the immunogenicity profile of existing vaccines, and vice versa, that those vaccines that you're going to be giving at the same time don't interfere with the immunogenicity profile or the safety profile of your vaccine. That's the only way those vaccines get into the schedule. Those studies are called concomitant use studies, and there are at least 800 of them that have been performed. To sit in your office and make up an alternative vaccine schedule smacks at least of hubris and certainly has done nothing for the good of children. But call it what it is. It's a delayed vaccine schedule. That's what it does. It separates, spaces out, or withholds or delays vaccines, which the only thing that accomplishes is that it increases the period of time during which children are susceptible to these diseases with no benefit. So there is no alternative schedule. I think it makes people feel better that they're not getting so many vaccines at once, but it certainly doesn't do any good for the child. And similarly, you could also argue that wouldn't it be more stressful to get, say, 5 vaccines at one time, which is, I think, hard for any parent to watch, than to get just a single vaccine. And so this, too, has been studied. Is it more stressful? The way that physiologists determine stress is they look at cortisol secretion. So there's a study done, which is a product of the adrenal gland that one uses in response to stress. So cortisol is a marker for stress. If you look at children who get 1 shot as compared to 2 or more shots, the level of cortisol secretion is the same, which is to say you're maximally stressed out at 1 shot. So to bring a child back frequently, because you've spaced out these shots, only increases stress. And frankly, if you're going to delay vaccines till over 2 years of age, all you're doing there, aside from increasing the period of time during which children are susceptible to diseases, is they're more likely to remember that they've gotten these shots, and you're only more likely to create needle phobia. So you do harm and no good when you choose this kind of schedule. Okay, so the next question is it better to be naturally infected than immunized? Well, to some extent, the answer to that question is yes. I mean, if the question is, are you more likely to have a better and longer-lasting immune response with a natural infection than vaccination, the answer is generally yes. I mean, a natural infection is much better able to induce an immune response. So, for example, if you look at measles, natural measles induces an immune response that's roughly 3-fold greater than that's induced by measles vaccine virus. But the problem with natural infection, obviously, is that you have to pay the price for natural infection, which in the case of measles can be death or it can be, dehydration or encephalitis or pneumonia. So the goal is, so it's not the right question. The right question is immunization good enough? And if we continue with the measles example, of course it's good enough. We basically were able to eliminate measles from the United States by the year 2000 with a measles vaccine. So that's the goal of a vaccine, is to induce the immune response that is a consequence of natural infection without asking the child to pay the price of natural infection, and vaccines certainly do that. To expose a child needlessly to a wild-type virus makes no sense, and this probably comes up today, occasionally you hear about the chickenpox party, which is the parent takes the child to the chickenpox party, and the reasoning is not completely crazy, it's mostly crazy, it's not completely crazy, is that if you're an adult that's infected with chickenpox, you are 10-fold more likely to develop pneumonia and encephalitis and be hospitalized than if you get chickenpox as a child. It's actually better to get chickenpox as a child. And so you could actually make the argument before the chickenpox vaccine came about in 1995 that it was of some value to get chickenpox earlier rather than later, since you were going to get it eventually. Now you have the chickenpox vaccine, so you don't have to worry about that anymore. You can get a chickenpox vaccine which can protect you for the rest of your life. And when people make this choice, and I just actually had somebody tell me this the other day, when people make this choice to get chickenpox instead of the chickenpox vaccine, what they've really done is now they have living latently or silently in their nervous system wild-type chickenpox or varicella virus. That means it's much more likely that they're going to get shingles, including severe shingles, later in life than had they gotten the chickenpox vaccine. So it's a terrible choice, this sort of chickenpox party idea. So in summary here, it's better to be immunized than naturally infected. Okay, so the next question, and this is sort of a multi-layered question. Why do vaccines contain dangerous products like formaldehyde, aluminum, and mercury? It's a leading question. This is the question the way that it's asked. But so let's go through each of these things. So formaldehyde is a chemical that is used to inactivate certain viruses. So, for example, the polio virus. I mean, this is the way the polio vaccine is made. This was Jonas Salk did this in the 1950s. Is he took polio virus, he purified it, then he killed the virus with formaldehyde, which is he did what we all do on vaccines, which is he tried to separate the part of the virus that induces an immune response, which is protective, from the part of the virus that causes you to get polio. So the best of both worlds. You get an immune response without having to be naturally infected. But some people say formaldehyde, wait, isn't that the same stuff that they use to preserve dead bodies? You know, my child's alive. I don't want them to get formaldehyde. Well, the fact of the matter is they've already gotten it, because ever since we crawled out of the ocean onto land, formaldehyde is a product of single carbon metabolism. You have about 10 times more formaldehyde circulating in your bloodstream than you would ever get from a vaccine. So formaldehyde is certainly not dangerous, because what you get in vaccines is much less than what you typically make on your own every day. Aluminum also sort of comes up. Aluminum is used as an adjuvant. An adjuvant is something that enables you to give fewer doses of vaccine or lesser quantities of antigen. We've been using aluminum salts in vaccines since the 1930s and safely. But the question is, can aluminum be toxic? And the answer to that question is yes. When you see aluminum toxicity, however, you see it in people who have two criteria. One is that they have kidneys that don't work, which is to say they're on dialysis, either hemodialysis or peritoneal dialysis. And two, they are receiving large sources of exogenous aluminum, typically antacids or sometimes in parenteral hyperalimentation. That's when you see aluminum toxicity. And when you see toxicity, it causes osteomalacia, which is to say a sort of a thinning or weakening of bones, and anemia and encephalopathy. But that's not vaccines. I mean, the quantity of aluminum that you get in vaccines is trivial and, frankly, dwarfed by the amount of aluminum that you typically get, assuming that you drink the water or eat any food that is basically on this planet. And since pretty much we're just talking about people on this planet, then this applies to everybody. So aluminum, again, although aluminum is actually the most abundant light metal on the Earth, in the Earth's crust, and the third most abundant metal. Everybody who drinks anything made from water, including breast milk or infant formula on this planet, will be exposed to far more aluminum than they would ever see in vaccines. So as Paracelsus, who was a chemist in the 16th century, said, the dose makes the poison. That's always true. I mean, if you live on the Earth's crust, then you are going to be exposed to heavy metals like, you know, mercury or arsenic or cadmium or thallium at levels that are far less than those that are dangerous. So the dose makes the poison. There is no zero tolerance when it comes to heavy metals, which brings us to the next point, mercury. Again, it's really the same story. We are all exposed to levels of methylmercury in either breast milk or infant formula, babies are, than they would ever be exposed to in vaccines. And vaccines don't contain methylmercury. They contain ethylmercury, which is a much bigger molecule, and therefore it's eliminated from the body much more quickly. So in short, the way this question is written is incorrect, because there's nothing dangerous about the quantities of formaldehyde, aluminum, and mercury that you receive in vaccines. Okay, the next one, and this also is sort of a little inside baseball, although God knows we get asked this question a lot in our Vaccine Education Center in Philadelphia. Do vaccines contain material from abortions? The answer to that question is yes, and let me explain to you sort of where this all comes from. In the early 1960s, there were two elective abortions that were performed, one in Sweden, one in England. They created two cell lines that had been used ever since. One of those cell lines is called WI38, the other one is called MRC5. Those two cell lines have been used to make three vaccines that are routinely given to infants and children. Hepatitis A, rubella, and varicella vaccines are all made using those cells, as is actually one of the rabies vaccines. So one could reasonably say this. I'm a Catholic. For me, abortions are a sin worthy of excommunication, which is to say I don't get to participate in Catholic society. I do not want to have injected into my child a vaccine that contains DNA material from what was an abortion that was performed about 50 years ago, now almost 60 years ago. So I don't want that vaccine. Now, so you could argue that that's a reasonable thing to say. So the good news is, however, the Catholic Church has ruled on this. A number of years ago, the major policy-making body of the Catholic Church is called the Pontifical Academy for Life. A few years ago, when Joseph Ratzinger was the head of the Pontifical Academy for Life, and as you may remember, Joseph Ratzinger became Pope Benedict XVI, who was the 265th Pope. He ruled on this, and he said that while those who made those vaccines acted, and I'm using his language, quote, in proximate association with evil, end quote, that those who give the vaccines aren't, and that because the vaccines clearly, you know, save lives, and in the case of rubella, prevent spontaneous abortions, these vaccines are of value. So the Catholic Church has ruled on this. If Catholics, for example, ask this question, you can say that there has been a ruling by the major policy-making body of the Catholic Church that these vaccines can still be given. Okay, so the next question is, why should I trust a product made for profit by pharmaceutical companies? Well, the good news is you don't have to. I mean, when vaccines are licensed and recommended, they are invariably subjected to what are called phase 4 or post-marketing studies. So this is done often through something called the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is a linked computerized medical records that represent about 6% of the United States population. So when a vaccine is put onto the market, very quickly you can tell through this linked databases who's gotten the vaccine and who hasn't. And you can very quickly tell whether there's a problem with that vaccine. So, for example, when the RotaShield vaccine was licensed in 1998, it became clear within frankly just a few months that there were increased numbers of children who had intussusception or intestinal blockage associated with getting that vaccine as compared to children of the same age who hadn't gotten that vaccine. And so then there was a more formal study done, and that vaccine was taken off the market after about 10 months. So people are looking. And aside from the fact that it's not in anybody's interest, including a company's interest, to make a product that could hurt children, that would knowingly hurt children, you don't have to trust pharmaceutical companies because someone's watching. Okay, so the next question is, can I avoid vaccine-preventable diseases by living a healthy lifestyle? The notion is that, you eat all the right foods, you're avoiding casein, you're avoiding gluten, you're eating a lot of sprouts, you're exercising a lot, you're avoiding GMO-containing foods, and all the other nonsense that sort of surrounds this kind of question. Here's what I would say. No matter how healthy you are, no matter how well you eat and how much you exercise, there are only two ways for your B cells and T cells to develop a specific immune response. Two ways. One is to be naturally infected, or two is to be immunized. So you can't be so immune that these viruses or bacteria simply bounce off you. And I'll give you a more specific example. Franklin Delano Roosevelt got polio when he was in his late 30s. This was a vigorous, active, healthy man who was felled by polio because, unfortunately, he lived at a time before the polio vaccine. So there is no being so healthy that you can ever avoid these diseases. Those are your choices: vaccination or natural infection, and vaccination is always the better choice. Okay, so the next question, and this is a tough one. Should vaccines be mandated? Well, a parent could reasonably say, look, I don't need the government to tell me whether or not to vaccinate my child. I will do my research, and I will make the best decision for my child. Well, first of all, frankly, if your child doesn't have a medical contraindication to vaccination, then a choice not to get a vaccine, frankly, is a bad choice. And if someone's saying that they've done their research and they've decided not to give a vaccine, then they haven't done enough research. And usually when people say they've done their research, what do they really mean? What they really mean is that they've looked on the internet and read other people's opinions about the vaccine. That's really not what research is. I mean, if you really want to do the research, for example, on the chickenpox vaccine, then read the 300 papers that have been written about the chickenpox vaccine, in the basic science papers that have been written about that vaccine. Now, that's hard to do. I think that if you're going to do that, you should have some expertise in virology, microbiology, immunology, statistics, including biostatistics, epidemiology. Most people don't have that. Truth is, most doctors don't have that. And so what do? We depend on those who at least collectively have that expertise, and you find that, for example, in groups like the Committee of Infectious Diseases for the American Academy of Pediatrics, or groups like the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practice to the CDC. So therefore, when people choose not to get a vaccine, they're making a choice that puts their child and those who come in contact with their child at unnecessary risk. Now, there are some countries where vaccines are not mandated and the immunization rates are incredibly high. Hungary, for example, does not have mandatory vaccines. They have immunization rates in the 99% range. The Scandinavian countries don't have mandated vaccines and have immunization rates that are similar to that of Hungary. I think, however, we are not that country. I think the United States is sort of founded on individual rights, individual freedoms. We have much more of a libertarian streak in this country, especially as it regards issues of jurisprudence. So I think that if we made vaccines optional, we would see much lower immunization rates, and as a consequence, we would see much higher rates of disease and death from these preventable infections. So I think the sad truth is we have to mandate vaccines in this country. Otherwise, our immunization rates would be lower, and children would suffer that. In a better world, people would trust the medical system that's making these recommendations, trust the pharmaceutical companies, trust the government. We don't live in that world, at least not in this country, and so we mandate vaccines. Okay, the next question is, how do you sort out good information from bad information on the Internet? This is a tough question to answer. I think that as a general rule, if information is provided by, for example, a .gov, that's usually a good sign. If it's presented by, say, a hospital or university, that's a good sign. And I think one simple way of distinguishing these things is when you look at the sites, for example, that give bad information, they're always selling something. It's either compounding pharmacies on how to cure your child of autism, or some of these sites serve as like clearing houses for personal injury lawyers on how you can get money from the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. I actually think if you look, it's not that hard to tell the difference, but certainly there are a lot of very reputable sites out there. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Every Child group called Every Child by Two. We at the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia also have a site. So there are good sites out there, but this is the problem with the Internet. I mean, it's a source of great and awful information, and it is a challenge to find the good stuff. So that's actually all I had. Thank you very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure being here in Idaho, and good luck.
Gary, could you stop recording?